Pleased to be the chair, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Nuri Martinez and Paul Krikorian. We have on the agenda today one singularly important item. I know an item that there's been lots of interest in for lots of different reasons. But we are concerned about how we develop a strategy and a structure for encouraging economic development, community economic development. And so this discussion today is real important as a part of that process. Mr. Clerk, why don't you read this item?
Item number 1 is a CLA and CAO joint report relative to a draft request for proposals for an economic development nonprofit entity. The CLA and the CAO are present for a presentation.
Okay, gentlemen, would you care to step forward? Mr. Santana, and I'm going to see it. Karen, thank you.
Good afternoon, Karen Kalfayan with the CLA's office, and Mr. Santana.
Miguel Santana, CEO. Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Just a little bit of background on this item. In June of 2012, the mayor and council approved the establishment of an economic development entity comprised of a new economic development department and a nonprofit that would contract with the city to carry out the city's economic goals and projects. The new Economic Development and Workforce Development Department was established in April of this year, earlier this year, and was funded in this current year's budget. As part of that April council action, the CAO and CLA were instructed to develop a draft request for proposals for the nonprofit component of that. So in July of this year, our office has released a report including the draft RFP, and that report is before you today. The RFP contains 5 areas of service for the nonprofit to provide, and then subsequent to the release of the report, we've received some input from council offices, the mayor's office, department, and the public, so we wanted to give you just kind of a verbal update of where we are at this time.
And as Ms. Kalfayan mentioned, this was part of a larger strategy. When the CRA was dissolved, the city was in a position, because it chose not to be the successor agency, to think about economic development differently. And so it was part of this proposal is one of 3 pieces. The first piece really is looking at strengthening the role of the Deputy Mayor of Economic Development, which the mayor is in the process of selecting someone for that role. The second is the creation of the department. And the third is working with the nonprofit. The nonprofit idea comes from research that we've done looking at the most successful models around the country. And we took sort of a hybrid approach between what some jurisdictions in California have done, like in San Diego, and other jurisdictions like in New York, where they work in partnership with an external group that essentially provides strategic planning around economic development, as well as helping the jurisdictions develop and manage their existing assets. So the way it would work here is, should we move forward, on the advice of the city attorney, we were advised to, instead of creating a nonprofit ourselves, we actually engage in an RFP and ask the business community and the development community what the interest is to partner with us in the establishment of this strategy. And at the time, we had heard that there was a number of different entities that were interested in engaging in this kind of partnership. So this is one to sort of test how much interest there is in the business community to partner with the city for this effort. The second direction that they gave, the city attorney gave, that in order for the nonprofit to really act as an independent body to provide advice based on the best interests of economic development, then it did have to have sort of an arm's distance from the city, and that's why, again, it is not being advised that it be created by us. And so this is one proposal. Now, obviously, given the fact that the CRA's role today is to basically discard its assets, transition, the city currently doesn't have a very effective economic development strategy. What we're hoping today is to get some direction from you as to how to proceed. The RFP reflects the input that we received from the mayor and council prior to July 1st and some direction we've gotten so far. But certainly if there was other alternatives that you'd like us to look at, this would be the best time to receive that direction so we could come back and establish a plan as soon as possible. There is some urgency around this issue, not only for the obvious reasons due to sort of the recovering economy, the need to create jobs, but also because the CRA is in the process of letting go of some of its assets, and the city may want to be in a position to take control over some of those assets and actually convert them into potential economic development projects. And the way economic development has existed in the city has, for those projects not in the CRA area, and it's been done on an ad hoc basis. So sometimes the CLA's asked to take the lead on a particular project. Sometimes my office is, sometimes the department is, sometimes it's led by the mayor's office. So there's inconsistent approaches to particular developments. And one of the suggestions that we were recommending here was finding a way to bring greater continuity and looking at an overall strategy citywide around economic development and having the nonprofit assist us in doing that, both on a macro level, as identifying which industries we should go after, how to best utilize the assets of the city, how to use either site-specific taxes or other kinds of incentives to attract the kind of businesses that we want to see, but also on an individual project level, which would be managed through a contractual relationship with the city. And obviously, your offices and the mayor would have a role in dictating. So with that, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you. And let the record just note that we've been joined by Council Members Huizar and Cedillo. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. First of all, thank you for the testimony. We certainly need to have some kind of a strategy, some kind of a structure, some kind of an infrastructure for economic development. And I think, as we all know, we really don't have that now. The idea of creating a department was certainly significant. And as you said, the discussion about a potential nonprofit being the entity has been discussed and reviewed, and I think by all accounts it's just not really cooked and ready yet. If we were able to come up with some kind of a structure, some kind of a format, some kind of a organization for economic development in the interim, what do you think it could look like? How could we leverage existing resources, not recreate the wheel, but what structures are in place now that we can adapt as we move forward over the next couple of years? I mean, my fear is that we're just still treading water, and if the idea of the nonprofit is still not cooked, which means that we may spend some more time in deliberating over that. There may be some other options out there that we're missing. How can we be prepared to move forward in an expeditious way?
Well, there's a couple of things. This is one of many reports that our two offices produced, and one of the initial reports, we did look at a variety of options, and we considered, strengthening the role of the Department of Economic Development and staffing that up. The challenge with that is obviously the city's own financial fiscal situation. We've essentially have benefited from the dissolution of the CRA by shifting the tax increment that would have stayed within the CRA areas and moving that to pay for police officers and fire services and the rest of the city. It's been a significant part of reducing the structural deficit. We did carve out about $2.5 million for this purpose, but in the scope of how much we received, it's frankly a drop in the bucket in terms of what ultimately needs to be done. The second option we looked at is what other structures exist that are engaged in economic development activity, and what has examples where we have been able to effectively work together. And there is a separate structure, it's the LA Development Fund, which was actually established by the city several years ago as a way of best allocating new market tax credits. This is a fund that is separate. It's a separate organization, and it has a separate fiduciary responsibility. It is not a city department, and on the board sits the CLA, CAO, the head of economic development, and who's the other?
Housing.
And housing.
And, yeah.
And so this body essentially looks at a number of different projects through a set of criteria that is established that are frankly mainly established by the federal government for eligibility for the new market tax credits, and allocates those credits. And in this particular case, the projects this is the final piece of an overall funding program. So the most successful projects are those that have all of their other funding secured and that need this sort of gap financing through the new market tax credits, and we go ahead and allocate them. And it is a somewhat of a competitive process because there aren't enough tax credits to cover all of the projects, so we evaluate with projects work. The alternative, the pluses of this kind of structure as an interim basis is that the city family is already at the table. So you have our two offices and other offices are involved in economic development activity. In the projects that have been successful on a massive scale, usually our two offices and others are involved. And so we help coordinate a lot of the activity and bring sort of the attention and the resources to get a project from point A to point B. So there is a potential value of using the LADF as an interim solution. The third alternative would be taking a step back from an RFP. This is a very prescriptive RFP based on the input that we received from your offices, from the mayor's office, but as well as a very extensive stakeholder process that our consultants went through. They've met with a number of stakeholders, business leaders, the various chambers and associations. Jerry and I had a meeting with neighborhood councils. We solicited as much input, so it's rather prescriptive in terms of what the approach would be. The good side about that is that we're trying to narrow down sort of the guessing of what it is that we're trying to do. The downside of that is that there may not be anybody who does this work, and so we don't know that until we release it. We could take a step back and say, well, let's do something a little bit broader, more of a RFI, a request for information or interest, to see, well, what ideas are there out there? What is sort of gauge the temperature of the business community, of the various chambers, both the large ones and the smaller ones, neighborhood-based, and solicit input in that context. And so that obviously, the plus side of that is obviously a much more inclusive process. It allows us to test the field a little bit. The downside of that is that it takes time. And the one thing that we all think does exist is a sense of urgency due to the economy, but also due to the fact that as properties become available, the city should have a vehicle to quickly develop those or to take on those new responsibilities. So we could certainly come back and explore that a little further and flush out some of these options.
I think it has to be kind of a two-step process. Yeah. What can we do sort of in the interim, and then what do we do longer term? And I agree. I think we do want to get some thoughts from the community in terms of strategies, in terms of ideas. Obviously, this nonprofit idea, didn't create the kind of interest that we had anticipated initially. But we do, we don't want to just be treading water in the meantime. So, members, any thoughts? Yes. Councilwoman Martinez.
I have a couple of questions. So The city every year needs to submit to the federal government the comprehensive economic development strategy.
The con plan is a,
Is it the comprehensive, the SEDS, the comprehensive economic development strategy? Isn't that what we submit to the feds? We don't? It was my understanding that we do, so I just wanted to link it to
Okay.
what we're doing today.
Money.
So we have to submit this to the feds, so are we, is this effort helping in that?
My understanding is that the SEDS is only for EDA projects.
Okay.
So if we are applying for an EDA grant, the requirement is that you do have to have a SEDS.
And that's the only time we submit a plan. So does that strategy help with this new economic development strategy that we're trying to get to? With this RFP? Is there at any point do we coordinate this effort?
It would help in coordinating the effort, yes.
I mean, one of the things, there's various pieces in which economic development takes place. So, we've been trying to coordinate the con plan, for example. How do we use CDBG money and around a strategic plan,
right,
and using the transit corridors as a vehicle for economic development. But that commits us in terms of particular dollars. When we had the CRA and it was robust, then if you were within the CRA area, you had specific goals and sometimes attached to a larger strategy. And in the context of the SEDS or other, but what's missing in the city that we've never really had is a comprehensive overall strategy around economic development, And so that's what we're trying to get to. And obviously all these other pieces should speak to that ultimately. But without sort of a larger view, we're sort of creating a strategy that's piecemeal.
And that was part of the initial thinking, is in having the economic development, the workforce development department, and some entity that would handle some of the projects. They would have some sort of a coordinated effort. So I think what we're looking for is a more comprehensive, coordinated economic effort.
Because what I understood from your earlier remarks is that we don't have an effective economic development strategy in the city. So when we do submit the SEDS to the feds, is that pointless since we don't seem to have a coordinated effort? That was my initial question.
Well, my guess is that it serves that particular purpose, but it's done in isolation to sort of a larger strategy.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So then I had two other questions. So getting back to the RFP, this definitely seems very ambitious, and I've only been here 10 weeks, but does it make sense to break this up? And perhaps not, I don't know if we have anybody to be able to meet these goals and objectives in this scope of work. It's incredibly ambitious. Not saying that it can't be done, but I'm just trying to be realistic. Is there a way to get someone to do this?
Well, I think that's part of the concern, is that maybe this is a little overly ambitious considering the structure that we have right now and what might be available to do that type of work. So if we were to look at options, that could be one of the options, along with if there's another option, as Mr. Santana said, is there could be some existing entity that could take this on an interim basis. So I think if we're going to look at options, we want to explore all of those.
And then the other question I had, would it be perhaps an idea we can explore, instead of a 4-year contract, make it a 2-year contract with an option to extend depending on how folks perform?
Well, one of the part of the feedback we received from the business community who had expressed interest to responding, actually there was some conversation of having a coalition, a consortium of chambers create a new entity to respond at some point, is that if there's going to be an investment made on the business side, they need to know that we're committed to it for a period of time. So we were running against two ideas. The first is that while this is prescriptive and rather ambitious, really the real work is going to take several years to actually be able to see the outcome of these efforts. And so in order to be able to engage in that longer term thinking, we need to know who that longer term partner is. So I think part of, what's being discussed currently is that maybe this is where we want to end up, but maybe what's required for the short term is something a little more short term, like you're suggesting, maybe a strategy that's 2 or 3 years to really help us navigate and be more specific as to ultimately what this looks like, and while still allowing for specific projects to move forward. And so one of the things we could come back at your next meeting or in a few meetings is really how do you break it apart in terms of phases to allow for the work to still get done without necessarily abandoning the notion of ultimately where we want to be.
Thank you, Mr. Cedillo.
So just some basic questions in terms of the RFP and stuff. So like what models, what cities are we looking at? Who does this? Where are the examples that we're looking at? Probably in different scales, but where would we look for that? I think one of the things in looking at some of the documents here, we have to be very clear about our goals, and some of it's outlined in terms of what the RFP is, but we really have to be, when we talk about economic development, be a little clear about what we're trying to do. I imagine that our chair here would be very thoughtful about how we generate revenue for the city, how we create consumers for the city, and that we're engaged, as it's noted in the document, in job development in some of our distressed areas, because we can do a lot of economic development, create a lot of wealth, but if it's not to the extent that it can be structured, designed in a way that we're creating a middle class, then it's not really effective for the city. And so those are some concerns, and I think those can be driven by a sharp focus, at least from the council, on what are our goals here, what are the priorities, and what are the goals of the city's economic strategy. So those are some questions. I'm interested in thoughts about partnerships with the chamber and stakeholders. And maybe, we have 2 very prestigious universities, 2 very prominent business schools. They issue forecasts. Is there a public-private partnership there that we could look at that might help guide us in this area?
So to answer your first question as to what model, so we looked at a number of different models around the country, and the one model that we kept on getting back to is a model that exists in New York City. Mm-hmm. So in that context, it's a quasi-governmental. It's not entirely independent because it's appointed by the mayor, the members of the Economic Development Corporation. But the one piece that we're really trying to duplicate is the use of city-owned assets. Mm-hmm. That are primed for economic development, and allowing that Economic Development Corporation to not only help the city figure out what's the best way to maximize that asset, mm-hmm. but also figuring out how do you best finance it, identify developers, create a partnership with other institutions, and actually deliver on it based on a larger strategy. So, for example, the one transition New York is going through is that, New York is the financial capital of the country and mm-hmm. the world, but that's an industry that's disappearing, or it, in terms of the number of job creation, it's not as aggressive as it has been. So after 9/11, there was a very focused effort to start transitioning the economy into other industries to diversify the economy. And so they've utilized the Economic Development Corporation to establish sort of a strategic plan around how do we diversify an economy that was so reliant on the financial community and go into areas that where New York could be more competitive in bringing biotech or technology or other industries, and converting city-owned assets for that purpose. And so And so you're seeing the implementation of that strategy around particular projects. And so there's a project that they've worked on to actually partner with the university to make it sort of a center of technology. They've also engaged in other areas to improve sort of tourism and the cultural tourism around the city. So it's the difference here, some of the feedback we got from talking to them, it said, the fact that we're part of New York is helpful, but it's also a liability sometimes because we are sort of an arm of them. So they're not entirely independent. And they felt that, or some of the folks we talked to said they would be more effective if they were slightly more independent. And so we sort of took the good parts of what we heard and then try to add the independent piece by, instead of having the leadership be appointed by the mayor, actually have him be organically established through a partnership with the chamber or various associations. So, but the two pieces that I think we strongly recommend is, one is a strategic plan, that there's actually some thought about what kind of economy do we want Los Angeles to have in the next 20 years, and what does that look like? What are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what is happening around us, how can we position LA based on the Pacific Rim to be competitive, how do we convert, and the second piece is how do we convert our own assets, properties that we own, whether it's owned by even the proprietaries, to implement that strategy. And so, and each project obviously has its own financing plans. Each one is sort of done and it has its own unique aspects, but attached to a larger. And of course, all of that would be contractually established through the city.
I was going to note the New York experience, but you brought it up, this whole aspects like to the tourism, the cultural tourism, things related to museums, things related to, they have Highline, they did a complete turnaround on Bryant Park. Those things would, in Los Angeles, we have our own areas, we have our own MacArthur Park, we have our own incredible, unlimited prospects around the LA River. Things that would help engender our tourism, and so we should look to see what that means for the city. I just want to make sure that we're focused on raising revenue for the city, and that we're focused on industries that are sustainable and that create good middle-class jobs for the city.
And I think that speaks to the development of an economic strategic plan, having all those part of it so that we're achieving the goals that you set forward.
I've struggled with getting my arms around this nonprofit since we first began discussing it in budget last year. And I think Ms. Martinez's comments just helped crystallize for me why I've struggled with it. And I think it's not just that this package of goals is ambitious, it's also that they're separate skill sets. And that's, I think, where I've struggled, is identifying what it is, to Mr. Cedillo's point, specifically what is it that we want this nonprofit to accomplish. And now the report and the RFP are identifying 5 entirely different goals that we're trying to accomplish. Goals that need to be closely coordinated, but different goals nonetheless. And now that we have a new department that's charged with this mission of economic and workforce development, I think the direction that I want to see us go in generally is to have that department be the hub of the wheel. And each of these different areas that are to be coordinated, whether by a nonprofit, by a public-private partnership, or by another aspect of city government, those 5 areas should be strategically coordinated by the general manager of the department, who will be accountable to the mayor and the council and the people of Los Angeles. And I think that's where I've wrestled with this model. I mean, particularly when it comes, for example, to to managing the city's assets in a strategic way to facilitate economic development. We sorely need to do that because we are not effective at all currently in managing our assets for that purpose. On the other hand, I feel pretty uncomfortable with the idea of just essentially handing that task over to an unaccountable nonprofit entity and saying, figure out what to do with the city's assets. So I still don't feel comfortable that, and maybe it's just me rather than the plan, but I don't know that I have come to a comfort level in figuring out where that balance is between what we coordinate internally and what will be within the hands of the nonprofit, and to what extent we're going to have oversight over that. So that's first general set of thoughts. Second, to Ms. Martinez's point, I think we really need to kind of look at the possibility of multiple RFPs here rather than a single one, breaking up these skill sets maybe into different areas. There might be multiple entities that can perform one aspect of this, but not so much another. The other advantage of that is that while I like the idea of, in some respects, giving it a try with a shorter-term contract, some of these objectives are long-term objectives, and they won't at all be measurable in the short term. So, but some will very much be measurable in the short term. Management of our property will be measurable on a month-to-month basis, pretty much. So I think if we were to split it up, it would have the advantage of being able to make that determination. What's the best term of the contract? How do you measure success? When it comes to strategic planning and policy development, I don't think we'll see results from that are going to be measurable within 2 years. So I wouldn't want to necessarily have that be a short-term contract, but when it comes to management of our assets, maybe more so. What was the last point? I guess the other point was, and I think I've raised this before to Mr. Cedillo's point. I would like to understand what has worked and not worked so well in these other places that this has been done. I know we've had some reports on that, but especially given the fact that we're just in this committee, this brand new committee, beginning the discussion, I think it would be worthwhile to have a deeper report about successes and failures of other cities and other entities. You know, how does this compare with what LAEDC does? Where is there redundancy? What lessons do we learn from their work? Where can we dovetail in their work? Or, you know, any of the other business promotion kind of entities that there are. So those are vague thoughts, I know, but they're just kind of thinking out loud with you. Since we are going to, I understand, bring this back at some point, Mr. Chairman, I just want to kind of get those thoughts. And I'm really interested in seeing in greater depth, you know, some review of what's happened in New York and elsewhere as well.
Okay. Mr. Huizar.
Thank you. And I think generally we are headed in the right direction. If we have looked at these other models, they're better than what we have now. We've heard of what's happening in New York and San Jose. I think they have a good model where if a particular company that's in a particular industry wants to move in the city, they actually point out to them what facilities may be available and what sets of incentives based on that industry they will get, because if they locate in their city. We are way behind that. And we talked a lot about how way behind we are just generally having a comprehensive economic development policy. But if we are going in a direction, I think we are going in the right direction. But what I hear my colleagues saying is that, you know, there's still some questions to be answered and some more information to be given. One of the questions I had is the one that Mr. Krikorian raised, which is the accountability. I'm still trying to understand where is that connection. What is going to be the relationship between the nonprofit and the department, and where does the buck stop? You know, and are we creating something where a lot of the responsibility is within the nonprofit, but yet the accountability can't get to the people of the city, right? And that means to the department, to the mayor, to the council. Is it going to be its own entity doing its own thing, and then at the end of the day, we can or cannot really provide our input, whether it's going in the right direction or not. That accountability piece, I think, still needs some answers. What's that relationship, and where does the buck stop? I initially, when I looked at this, was reluctant to think about our properties, right, in our public, but I mean, we need to do something. Unfortunately, we have a system where if the local council member has the initiative to do something about some parcel, some city parcel in their in their district, something will happen. Well, it shouldn't be like that. We're losing a lot of opportunities to move forward. I have some property, an old facility in Highland Park that we've been looking to get a new, possibly youth center there, but it's very difficult for a council office to provide the resources and will and move that forward. I mean, this should be happening automatically someplace in the city to move that forward and make the best use of that property. At first I was reluctant to make it part of this, but I think if it's economic development or it's just the city better managing its own property for whatever it is, it may not be economic development, it could be, you know, putting a youth center there, right? So, but something needs to happen there. And I'm wondering if we are in this direction and this nonprofit starts providing us with an analysis and research about our assets and what best to do with them, do we, you know, we need to make sure we're coordinating with GSD, and if any ordinances need to be changed, I'm sure we probably looked at that, but I'm not even sure we know what that means that this nonprofit will do there at this point. So I think that needs to be better looked at as well. But generally, I think we're going in the right direction. I just think we need to refine this, and the biggest piece for me, as I mentioned, is accountability.
On your final note on the issue of the asset management, so concurrent to this discussion, there's been a separate but related discussion happening around asset management overall in the city. So the fact of the matter is that while the city may own hundreds of parcels of land and buildings, that most of those are not really intended for economic development purposes. We still have a responsibility to best manage our assets when we're maintaining them. Everything from, you know, having a strategy around how we lease space versus owning space, looking at where we house people. So there's been your council has directed that there be a more strategic planning around asset management as a whole, by putting some of that responsibility in my office and coordinating with GSD. So what would happen is that ultimately, after that assessment is done of a parcel and it's determined that, you know, while this is currently used for city use, it's not the best use, and there's already organic activity happening either along the river or somewhere in the community that's better primed for economic development. What do you do at that point? Whose charge is it to develop that into from a public works yard into sort of a commercial center? And right now we have, you know, it's done on an ad hoc basis, right? So sometimes you direct Jerry to do it, sometimes you direct me to do it, sometimes you direct the department to do it, and so we're trying to bring greater coordination on that. But what I'm hearing sort of overall is first the need for an interim step, that this may be too much to chew all at once, and there's a need to sort of look at this in a phased way. The accountability part, how does this all tie together, and who ultimately is responsible, right, and the role of the department. Having clear goals, both short-term and long-term, looking at how do you define success, you know, at the end of this process, and then attaching it, and then doing it, looking at these issues, maybe taking another look at around the most successful models around the country and how does that fit in. So we can certainly come back, try to fine-tune what we've established based on the input.
Okay. Yes, Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. One other thing, as we're looking at other cities that we might want to look at, since essentially the city is providing seed money for this effort, and it's my understanding that it's the expectation that there will be private funding that's provided as well to the nonprofit. Is that correct?
Well, the goal is, in the way, at least in other jurisdictions, they become self-funding through the way they engage in asset management. They will generate fees through that, and so ultimately they become self-sufficient.
Okay. I recall that when we discussed this in budget, that the idea was we needed to move together with some commitment of funding from the city because there were already private commitments in place for possible sources of funding. Is that correct?
I think that was the original concept 2 budgets ago.
Okay.
And then I think
It goes by so fast. Whatever the current status, my point is that if there is going to be non-public sources of funding for this, then that does raise an issue around conflict of interest that we're going to need to address. So if one industry puts up a lot of money for this, and then the strategic plan happens to be one that suggests that industry is really the future of Los Angeles, that would raise eyebrows. So I'm sure that the other cities that have dealt with this have crossed that bridge already, so that would be something I would, further to the issue of accountability, I think we would want to make sure that we had belts and suspenders when it comes to potential conflicts.
That's right.
Mr. Chair, I have a couple more questions.
Yes, Ms. Martinez.
Is there a way when the item comes back to committee to invite outside experts on economic development to share their perspective with the committee? Have we done that in the past?
So we hired a consulting firm who specializes in this area. We could certainly ask them to come back and represent the original report. There was some other, I think the business community came out at the time too, and we did solicit advice from the 2 major universities. But I think it's fair to do sort of a representation of that so that you have the benefit of that information as well. So we'll do that.
Okay, good idea.
And one more question. And after the dissolution of the CRA, how has the city redirected those CRA dollars for economic development?
So generally, they're general fund dollars. So they just go back to the general fund, and it's been a big part of how we've been able to reduce the structural deficit.
Yeah, and how those monies are used in the, on an ongoing basis would be part of the budget discussion that would take place each year.
Members? Okay, well, I think we've had certainly some good discussion and giving you some direction.
Yes.
Let's plan on coming back in 30 days or so regarding certainly options regarding the nonprofit. But I also heard some conversation about, what do we do, until that nonprofit, if that happens, what do we do until then? Kind of what's our short-term strategy for managing and for coordinating resources and assets? And so, if there are no objections, members, we'll ask them to come back 30 days with a report on those 2 items.
Very well.
Okay?
We will do that.
All right, thank you. We do have a card on the topic, and thank you for your testimony and for the presentation. Now let's invite up Noel Fleming. Noel, Central City Association.
Good afternoon, council members. Noel Fleming, Director of Legislative Affairs for Central City Association. I'm just here today to tell you about our efforts over the last 9 months. CCA has been leading a coalition of business organizations on this topic of a dedicated nonprofit entity for economic development issues for the city. Our geographically diverse coalition has included the LA EDC, the LA County Business Federation, the LA Business Council, Valley Economic Alliance, VICA, Hollywood Chamber of Commerce, Valley Economic Development Corporation, National Organization of Women Business Owners, and the LA Coalition for Economy and Jobs. All of these organizations have expertise in bringing investment and jobs to LA, and while we support the city's efforts to contract economic development functions to organizations having the skill and expertise, we ask that you carefully deliberate the scope and the goals of the RFP moving forward, and you guys have done that today. We appreciate the urgency because CRA assets do need to be handled. And we certainly don't want to lose any federal funding available for economic development strategy. But in the long term, it's really essential that the elements of the RFP are designed by private sector experts. We know what it takes to implement successful strategies. We know the market. We know how to make it work in a complex environment like LA. So we think it's critical for the private sector to be at the table and really to lead this effort and be responsible for designing and shaping the elements of the RFP itself. Ultimately, it's going to be us that brings the jobs and investment to LA. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I'm looking forward to working with you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Clerk, is there anything else on our agenda?
No, sir, that clears the desk.
Okay, members, any other business? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Right on.